Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War history. In today's episode, we explore the Battle of Vicksburg and Grant's bold gamble. Ulysses S. Grant devised a brilliant plan to capture Vicksburg. It broke a year-long deadlock and split the Confederacy in two. The citizens of Vicksburg would scarcely remember a more beautiful evening. The sky on April 16, 1863 was cloudless, and as the ruddy glow of twilight faded, the vast expanse was speckled with stars. The city was perched on high bluffs above the mighty Mississippi River, just below a place where the Father of Waters bent back on itself. It was the time of a new moon, and therefore much of the surrounding countryside was shrouded in darkness. Vicksburg citizens knew that somewhere out there in the inky void, Union land and naval forces were hovering, but the Northerners had tried to take the city for a year. All they received for their trouble were 12 months of aborted attacks and frustrated hopes. In peacetime, Vicksburg was a prosperous town of some 4,500 souls. In war, it assumed a strategic importance far beyond its population figures. If the Mississippi River was, in Lincoln's phrase, the backbone of the rebellion, then Vicksburg was its guardian. It was also a railroad hub where men and supplies from the Western Confederacy were funneled through to the East. The Federals had taken New Orleans in April of 1862 and were working their way north, while Grant's forces were moving south down the mighty river. Once Vicksburg was taken, the entire length of the river would be under Union control, and the Confederacy would be divided in two. The capture of Vicksburg was an essential ingredient in the North's plan to subdue the South and restore the Union. But from late 1862 to the spring of 1863, Federal forces were cursed by failure. In December 1862, an attack led by Major General William Tecumseh Sherman proved abortive. It seemed that all Union plans were plagued by ill luck. However, Major General Ulysses S. Grant and his Army of the Tennessee were not about to give up so easily. Grant pinned his hopes on trying to get his 45,000-man army to flank Vicksburg and proceed to the dry and stable ground to the east of the city. A cut-off canal was attempted, a project that would essentially bypass Vicksburg and allow the Navy to transport his army south of the beleaguered city. In a second effort, the Lake Providence Canal Project, begun in February of 1863, was a bold effort to connect a labyrinth of bayous and small waterways and create a path into a 400-mile circuitous route past Vicksburg. Those efforts proved abortive because mud reigned supreme. Bluecoats traded rifle muskets for spades, dredging up tons of viscous muck, but rains flooded the evacuations and drowned their labors as well as their hopes. Disease was also present, and the ranks were thinned by dysentery, pneumonia, typhoid, and the dreaded yellow fever. Ever-probing joint Union Army and naval forces also tried to break through the swampy, waterlogged territory just north of the city, first at Yazoo Pass, then at Steele's Bayou. The Union Army had started work on these projects in February of 1863 and March of 1863, respectively. The low-lying terrain was a nightmare. 200 miles of bayou thick with trees, crawling with snakes, and riddled with disease. It was said bobcats, snakes, and other swamp creatures would suddenly drop down on the gunboats from the overhanging canopy of dense trees, only to be swept off the decks by alert sailors armed only with brooms. The Confederate infantry threatened to capture Rear Admiral David D. Porter's naval assets deployed in the struggling Yazoo expedition. It was the last straw. Literally bogged down, Porter asked Sherman for help to drive away the enemy. Sherman obliged, but the whole force turned back. It was another failure. Confident that the Federal forces would never succeed, many Vicksburg townsfolk felt it was time to celebrate their good fortune. A ball was scheduled for the evening of April 16, 1863, at one of the city's finest mansions. Confederate officers wore their dress uniforms and ladies their finest gowns. The Yankees might be somewhere out there, but they were a mere nuisance, no more than buzzing flies at a picnic. But the Vicksburg celebrations were premature. Grant was about to open a whole new phase of the Vicksburg campaign, brilliant in design and bold in scope. Part of the plan was to run a convoy of transports downstream, but to do so meant running past several miles of Confederate guns that protected the city. It was a calculated risk, but it had to be done if Grant's plan was to succeed. Porter readily agreed to Grant's proposal. Once south of Vicksburg, Porter and his ships would rendezvous with the Army of the Tennessee and shuttle the Bluecoats from Louisiana to Mississippi. The heart of the plan was to approach Vicksburg from the east, where dry and firm ground provided stability for artillery and generally favored an attacking army. Porter, imposing with his full beard and military bearing, was also a keen observer and subtle tactician. There would be about a dozen Federal ships making the downriver attempt, a mixed force of ironclads and transports. The admiral issued orders to pilots and captains that they were to hug the western Louisiana shore, where the thick groves of trees that lined the banks combined with the new moon's feeble light to cloak their passing. But if they were discovered, the Federal ships were to proceed with all possible haste to the eastern banks of the Mississippi. This seemed counterintuitive, even suicidal, because that was the Vicksburg side of the great river. Nevertheless, orders were orders, so Porter's subordinates were going to follow his commands. But there was a method to his madness. The admiral had observed something in previous gun duels with the Confederate batteries. Still, it was a gamble. It was about 10 p.m. when the Union convoy rounded the point, Porter's flagship, the Benton, in the lead. At first, all was well, but then Confederate spotters saw the Federal ships in the inky void and raised the alarm. Sentries fired signal cannons to report the first notes in the symphony of artillery fire. Suddenly, small flames shot up in one place, then another and another. These were from barrels of tar and pitch placed at intervals to provide light for emergencies like these. Cotton bales soaked in oil were also set ablaze. As if it were not enough, small sheds and warehouses that lined the levee were put to the torch. The flames crackled and danced, combining with the blazing cotton bales and tar barrels to produce a lurid but ever-brightening glow that illuminated the Mississippi for at least a mile. The Federal ships could be seen clearly now, seemingly perfect targets for the 30-odd guns that lined Vicksburg's riverfront defenses. These cannons sprang to malevolent life with ear-splitting roars. The Union ironclads fired in counter-battery, the whole scene dissolving into confusion and chaos. Shells rained down to detonate in lethal bursts of metal, smoke, and flame. The Federal ships began to maneuver toward the Vicksburg shore, seemingly within point-blank range of the Confederate batteries. But Porter's observations were correct. For the most part, the Confederate guns, mostly situated in high bluffs, could not depress low enough if the Union ships came too close. The upper works of the ships might be smashed to kindling, but they were still unscathed otherwise. Ironically, the grand Vicksburg ball also unwittingly played into Union hands. Many of the artillery officers were attending the festivities, and it took time amid all the noise and confusion to report back to their posts. Yet the river seemed to be on the south side that night. The Mississippi River was treacherous at the best of times, and currents and eddies threw some Union ships off course. A few were even grounded, but managed to free themselves under heavy fire. The Lafayette had the misfortune to run aground right in front of the Confederate batteries. The rebels did manage to depress their guns enough in this sector to do Lafayette some serious damage. Nevertheless, though the crippled ship received 9 direct hits, she freed herself and continued on. Only one coal transport, the Henry Clay, caught fire and was lost. It was a spectacular success. All ships save the Henry Clay had made it through. Porter's casualties were also light, with no dead and only 12 wounded. Pleased with the success, Porter ordered another run a few days later. The April 22nd attempt was not as lucky. 6 barges were sunk out of the dozen that were being towed down the river. Still, the operation was enough of a success for Grant to begin the boldest and riskiest part of this plan. The first step was to have his army cross the great river to the Mississippi side, which was no small undertaking, especially if there was Confederate opposition on the eastern shore. The Army of the Tennessee marched down to a spot some 35 miles south of Vicksburg and ferried across the Mississippi to the high ground at Bruinsburg. Grant's troops were no doubt pleased by the move, having literally gone through hell and high water during the preceding months. His passage was uncontested thanks to some well-planned diversions. Colonel Benjamin Grierson led 1,700 Union cavalry on a raid behind Confederate lines, ripping up railroad lines and diverting Confederate attention away from Grant. Sherman's men also staged maneuvers that looked like the Federals were going to attack Vicksburg from the north near Chickasaw Bluffs. It was only a diversionary feint, but the Southerners were completely taken in. The next week or so would establish Grant's real worth as a field commander. Once his army was across the river, conventional military wisdom would have him drive north toward Vicksburg, at the same time keeping contact with his communication and supply line on the Mississippi. Grant had no intention of being conventional. He knew that Confederate General Joseph Johnston was at Jackson, the Mississippi state capital, 40 miles from Vicksburg, trying to scrape together additional Southern forces. Johnston commanded the Department of the West, one component of which was Pemberton's Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana. If he besieged Vicksburg and left Johnston unmolested, Grant might eventually regret it. Johnston might hit Grant on the right flank and perhaps even relieve Vicksburg. In Grant's view, it was better to drive inland and take on Johnston. Once Johnston was neutralized, he could turn back and attack Vicksburg. To drive inland meant breaking loose from his supply and communications, but Grant was confident his men could live off the land. He was right, but the maneuver produced some anxiety for Lincoln in the North, because for more than 2 weeks, Grant and his army disappeared. When the Army of the Tennessee finally reappeared, it had just completed a military tour de force. In 17 days, Grant's army had marched 180 miles and fought and won 5 engagements against Confederate forces. The last engagement, a clash at Big Black River Bridge on May 17th, was only 10 miles from Vicksburg. The Confederates had not only been defeated, but suffered a collapse that ended in a near rout. Exhausted, ragged, and parched with thirst, the dispirited rebels quickly streamed back to Vicksburg. A Vicksburg woman was shocked at the appearance, describing them as wan, hollow-eyed, ragged, footsore, and bloody. This exhausted and demoralized army seemed in no condition to defend the city. Their arrival also meant that there would be some 30,000 extra mouths to feed. Vicksburg was nicknamed the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, a description that was not far off the mark. The main defensive line around the city ran 6.5 miles. Nature lent a hand with terrain of various heights, including lofty bluffs and hills with steep elevations. The natural features were augmented by forts, trenches, redoubts, and lunettes. Major fortifications defended the city's approaches. There was Fort Hill, Stockade Redan, 3rd Louisiana Redan, Great Redoubt, Railroad Redoubt, Square Fort, and South Fort. Fort Hill sat atop a high bluff north of the town, and Stockade Redan dominated the graveyard road approaches to Vicksburg. Railroad Redoubt protected the gap that allowed the vital, at least in normal times, railroad line to enter the city. A salient along Hill's Ferry Road was protected by Square Fort. Grant decided to assault Vicksburg immediately in hopes that the city would fall quickly. His army was in a fervorous mood, having experienced a string of successes, and Confederate morale seemed low after the last devastating defeat. Then, too, Grant was worried about the potential fire in the rear. That is, Johnston might have received a drubbing, but there still was a good chance he could gather forces and march to Vicksburg's relief. The Army of the Tennessee comprised 3 corps: 15th Corps under Sherman, 8th Corps under Major General John A. McClernand, and the 17th Corps under Major General James B. McPherson. Grant ordered the assault to start at 2 p.m. on May 19th. Although the Union troops were in fine fettle and ready to go, they sweltered under a torrid Mississippi sun to which the men had a hard time adjusting. Private William Morgan Davies of the 95th Ohio of the 15th Corps was part of the reserves assigned to exploit any breakthrough. He later recalled the extreme heat, noting that he and his comrades had perspiration oozing out of every pore. The attack was launched on schedule, long lines of blue-coated infantry moving forward at a brisk pace, their regimental flags waving proudly. The Stockade Redan proved a particularly tough nut to crack. Confederate artillery was well served, and the gouts of smoke and flame tore bloody gaps into the well-ordered ranks. Confederate rifle fire also peppered Sherman's men, and scores of stricken soldiers crumbled to the ground as the lead bullets slammed into their bodies. The first wave attack was a failure, so the Bluecoats fell back to their own lines. Grant ordered his artillery to soften up the Confederate positions, and then troops from Major General Francis P. Blair went forward to see if they could make a breakthrough. The Bluecoats scrambled up Stockade Redan's abatis, then had to negotiate a 6-foot-deep, 8-foot-wide ditch under heavy rifle and artillery fire. Once past these obstacles, the Union troops had to scale the Redan's 17-foot-high wall. Some made it into the ditch, but got no farther. There was little left to do but to call off the attack. Bloody but unbowed, the Army of the Tennessee was still confident it could take Vicksburg by general assault. It was obvious the Confederate defenses were strong, but the memory of the brilliant maneuvers of the past week sustained the Army's basic faith in itself and its abilities. Grant decided to renew the assault on May 22nd, but this time the preparations were going to be done with much more care. This would be a grand general assault, with all 3 corps taking part in the operation. Sherman would take the right, McPherson the center, and McClernand the left. Grant hoped that such a major effort would achieve a breakthrough. The attack began at 10 a.m. after a preliminary bombardment of 4 hours. Once again, Sherman's men were going to have a crack at the Stockade Redan, but this time the operation included some thoughtful planning. A storming party of about 150 men would take the lead, carrying scaling ladders, rough-hewn logs, and some lumber. Being in the vanguard was bound to attract Confederate fire, so chances of surviving were slim. Because of this, only unmarried volunteers were accepted. The first volunteer to come forward was Private David Day of the 57th Ohio, who was only 16 years old, but already a veteran with a year's soldiering under his belt. The idea was for some of the men to carry the logs, 2 men to a log, and dash forward toward the Redan ditch. The men in the first group were to throw the logs across the ditch, making a foundation of a bridge. A second group would bring up lumber planking to complete the span. A third group would bring the scaling ladders to further assist in the assault. Once the bridge and scaling ladders were in place, the rest of Major General Francis Preston Blair's 2nd Division would move forward along a narrow front, a blue-clad column that just might break through Southern defenses. But things went sour quickly. Colonel William Wallace Witherspoon's 36th Mississippi Infantry bravely defended Stockade Redan. The rebels poured a murderous fire into the first group. To make matters worse, the first group had to cross nearly a quarter of a mile of open ground to reach its objective. By the time they reached the ditch, about half were killed and wounded, and so many had fallen that there were not enough logs or lumber to make a bridge. As the survivors sheltered in the ditch, they found that the Confederates could not depress their guns low enough to get them. Frustrated, the Southerners improvised and began lobbing and rolling 12-pounder shells into the ditch. Luckily for the first group, many of the fuses were too long, allowing the bluecoats a few extra seconds to throw the lethal shells back to the Confederates. Still, some of the shells did detonate in the ditch, and the explosions blew off heads and limbs with horrifying ease. Sherman's advancing infantry brigades also made little headway. As one Union soldier remembered, men fell like grass before the reaper. Sherman, a tough soldier not known for being squeamish, finally threw in the towel. "This is murder," he said. "Call those troops back." All along the 3-mile assault line, the story was the same. As Grant later remembered, the attack was gallant, and portions of each of the 3 corps succeeded in getting up into the very parapets of the enemy and planting battle flags upon them, but at no place were they able to enter. Survivors had managed to come so heartbreakingly close and even momentarily seize parts of the Confederate fortifications had to make their way back to Union lines under the cover of darkness. Private Day survived. His courage under fire won him the Medal of Honor. Grant's casualties for the day amounted to about 3,000 men. Southern losses were around 500. The troops had fought 8 hours under a burning sun. It was so hot that some were felled by heat stroke, not bullets. Union dead and wounded lay sprawled in the killing ground in front of the fortifications, trapped in a kind of no-man's land between the 2 armies. Apparently afraid to show weakness, Grant at first refused any notion of a truce to collect the wounded and bury the dead. Hundreds of corpses, blackened and swelled in the heat, produced a sickening stench, but the plight of the wounded was truly pitiful. Grant relented, and a truce was declared on May 25th. By then, the corpses were so foul and crawling with vermin that they were almost indescribable, but the grim burial work had to be done. The thirst-crazed wounded, who somehow managed to survive the ordeal, also found help. But it was also a time for a brief fraternization between North and South. Johnny Reb and Billy Yank swapped coffee and tobacco, played cards, and for a few brief hours forgot politics. Some were reunited with old comrades, people they had known before the war. The assault gamble had failed. There was nothing to do at that point but to conduct a full-scale traditional siege with basic techniques that had not changed much since the days of the renowned French military engineer Marquis de Vaughan in the 17th century. And while bombardments pounded the city and trenches and parallels were dug, the noose would be tightened to make sure no supplies were to reach the beleaguered city. Vicksburg would starve. The gently undulating hills and high bluffs were made out of loess, a fine-grained clay soil that was fairly easy to excavate. As the Union bombardment intensified, more and more citizens buried into the hills to find shelter. As one woman put it, caves were all the rage. Their elegant antebellum homes were abandoned, replaced by man-made caverns that were dirty, stifling, and plagued by mosquitoes and snakes.
It's your history. Learn it, know it, love it. Like and follow so you don't miss any of the exciting episodes from Mad Hatter's Civil War history.